It's time now for French Connections, our weekly look at the intricacies of life here in France with Florence Filmineau.
Hey,
Hi, Flo. Okay, so if you spent any time here recently, you've noticed this, that the tourists are back, and especially foreign tourists. There's been 2 years, the tourism industry was affected pretty seriously by the pandemic, but it looks like it's going again.
They're back, Monty. But it must be said the last 2 years have been really brutal for the tourism industry here in France, between the multiple lockdowns, the curfews, the travel regulations, changing rules and regulations. It was so confusing, and all this means that a lot of people, especially foreigners, just decided to stay home. Now, for some French people, the COVID pandemic was actually an opportunity to stay in France and discover France, but that wasn't enough to make up for the lack of foreign tourists. And it was a really tough blow for all sectors of the tourism industry, whether tour operators, restaurants, hotels, tourist attractions. But now it seems like things are looking up again. And as you can imagine, people who work in the tourism industry are thrilled.
Des Anglais, des Allemands, des Néerlandais également. Donc ce sont des pays en général qu'on touche pendant la haute saison. Et donc les gens reviennent petit à petit.
Ça va mieux après ces 2 ans de Covid, ça a été un peu plus compliqué. Où là, oui, on sent vraiment un renouveau et les gens sont là.
So getting back to normal is what people are working on in the tourism industry because France is the #1 tourist destination in the world.
And it has been for decades. Now, before the pandemic, France was beating its own record year after year. There was a slight dip following the 2015 terrorist attacks and the Yellow Vest movement. But, for instance, in 2019, nearly 90 million people visited France, making it the top tourist destination in the world, ahead of Spain and the United States. Now, the aim had been 100 million tourists by 2020, and then the pandemic hit. You can see the crowds here. Some would argue there were a few too many tourists in France before the COVID pandemic. This is the Louvre. These are people queuing up to watch the Mona Lisa, to look at the Mona Lisa, and for some, it wasn't a very agreeable experience.
It's incredible how many people are inside, and it's not like relaxing watching some nice pictures.
Now, these days, things aren't as crowded, and it must be said that COVID has changed quite a few things. For instance, you really do have to book a ticket in advance to visit most museums, like the Louvre, and all this limits capacity. But make sure that you book your ticket in advance because you don't want to end up coming to Paris all this way and not being able to get in.
Oh, that's for sure. So I guess the question is, what makes France so special? Why is it the top destination?
Well, it's hard to sum it up in just 5 minutes, and also being half French, it's hard to do so in a very neutral way. But let's just say that France has a lot going for it. In fact, there's really something for everyone here in France. The scenery, first of all, is incredibly diverse. It goes way beyond the wild charm of Paris. There are the coastlines in the French Riviera, the snow-capped Alps, the Loire Valley, and then all the beautiful overseas territories as well. Whether you're a city person or a lover of nature, there's something for you. Now, there's also the size of the country that means that it's really easy to navigate. You don't have to travel long distances to see all sorts of diversity like you do, say, in the United States. It's very easy to access as well because of its location. And this means that, here in France, we often talk about American tourists or Chinese tourists, but actually the tourists that come the most are from neighboring countries. The #1 tourists who come to France are from the UK, followed by Germany and Belgium. Now, another major asset is, of course, the gastronomy here in France. I won't go into it, but all the food and wine, wow, we could go on for hours. And then the country is steeped in history and culture. Foreigners love it, to be short, essentially. And there's something about the way they feel here as well. There's a certain romance to France.
The Tour Eiffel, it's the most beautiful thing in the world for me.
It's romantic, and the Eiffel Tower is nice.
Very warm. They are always smile, and they just treat you like friends.
We love France. We'll come every time.
Yeah.
Well, so there's a lot of love for the Eiffel Tower, but it's actually not the most visited monument in Paris, is it?
That's right. And you'd think it might be something like Versailles or Mont Saint-Michel, but it's actually Disneyland Paris.
No way.
Yes, originally called Euro Disney. This really surprised me. About 15 million people a year visited Disneyland in Paris before the pandemic. Now, talking about tourism in general, though, in France, it's hard to underestimate just how important it is for the French economy. Let's take a look at the figures. These are according to the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You can see tourism makes up 8% of GDP in France and represents about 2 million jobs. So a lot of people's livelihood depends on tourism in France.
Well, so French tourism officials are eager to get back to business as usual, breaking their own record for the number of tourists visiting the country.
That's right. Maybe we will end up meeting that 100 million tourists a year in France, hopefully in a sustainable way. But that many million people can't be wrong, right? But just to end on a linguistics note that I found quite interesting, the word tourisme, so the French word for tourism, actually comes from the English word tourism, because the English were the first to develop mass tourism. And all this comes from the Latin, actually, the word turnus, which was a tool for making circular things, comes from the Greek as well. Now, it's basically all about making a big circle and coming home. I don't know about you, but it makes me want to go on a French holiday adventure.
Oh, yeah. And there's so many reasons to love France, aren't there? Okay. Thanks a lot, Flo. For this edition of French Connections and for other editions as well, you can go to our website, france24.com.